Welcome to today's Google Hangout on fire engineering. We got a great show for you today. We also have a great week next week at FDIC. We have today with us Graham Peaslee, and unfortunately, Bobby Halton is catching a plane to Indianapolis, and PJ Norwood is traveling back to Connecticut, getting ready for FDIC. And PJ's my name guy, so I'm going to have Jim introduce himself so I don't slaughter his name. Jim, welcome on to Politics and Tactics today.
Well, thank you, Frank. But believe me, I'm used to it by now. But the last name is Burneka.
Jim Burneka is here. He's been doing great work, and all of our viewers already know Graham Peaslee, the scientist, the fire services scientist and researcher that's just been doing unbelievably unbiased work, and it's just great to have both of them there. Jim, one of the reasons why I called and I asked you to come on the show is you seem to take a leadership role and a push to get firefighters to understand what's going on with forever chemicals in their gear, but also this isn't just another show about forever chemicals in your gear. There's an opportunity to take some action here. So can you explain a little bit about that, and then we'll kick it back and forth to Graham?
Absolutely. So really the gist of this started with the IAFF resolutions that you helped out with back in January. That's where we were able to see that the firefighters that are actually wearing this gear don't want to have these chemicals in it. So with that being said, the very next logical step was, well, what do we have to do to get rid of these chemicals? And it all came down to NFPA. So there's a UV light test in NFPA 1971, and that's where the PFAS is basically has to live right there. And in order to have gear that doesn't have these chemicals, the fluorine, the PFAS, we have to get rid of that UV light test, do something about that. And that will allow us to actually have gear that doesn't have these chemicals in it any longer. And that's the way to do that is a TIA. And it's a long, kind of crazy process, just like anything to do with NFPA, but that's what we were able to establish, and that's what's ongoing right now.
Well, to back up a little, because you said the IAFF resolution, it's important to say, and while I played a small role in that, it's important to say that the IAFF, while they're championing this now, which I think is great, they were brought there kicking and screaming by Diane, who's been the moral compass for the fire service on this issue. So I believe that the bulk of that policy pressure came from Diane telling her story and not caring how crazy we all thought she was when she was bringing this to us. So my hat's off to Diane. And it's great now that the IAFF is taking a watchdog role, because that's supposed to be the union's job, is to be the watchdog for their members. But we can't forget the history that watchdog was being walked by the chemical companies they were supposed to be watching, and that they were cashing their checks. So I'm glad to see it turn. And again, I'm not against the manufacturers or against the IAFF or anything of that nature, but we need to have an honest conversation and make sure that everybody understands the history, how this all came about. And I was very proud to see the IAFF and the members and the delegates pass that resolution that they essentially aren't going to take money from the chemical companies anymore. They're going to take out that conflict of interest. So there's not even an inference of something going on that's improper. And I think that's important for the union to do. And I applaud them and I give them credit for doing that. And I give you a lot of credit for stepping up. And Graham has been there from the very, very beginning, because he was kind of the groundbreaker to say, wait a second here, we need to ask more questions. And I just go back real quick to the Revolutionary War. The last drill master of Valley Forge, when Washington tapped him to train the troops, he was very frustrated with our troops because he said, they're not like European troops. They need to know why. Why are they doing the operation, not just do the operation? And I think that that's important in politics, in science and safety. We need to ask the question why. And we need not already decide what the answer is to why. And that's what we see in politics. And all too often now we're seeing it in science. So that's why I have a lot of respect for Graham, is he went into this saying, well, I think this could be the case, but here, let's do the real science. Let's do the work. So Graham, for our listeners that haven't heard you, if you could kind of give a little bit of your background, because I know that I can't do it justice.
Nope, I'd be happy to, Frank, and that's a very kind introduction. I'm a scientist at Notre Dame, and I'm a nuclear chemist by training. I do nuclear physics here. And that's sort of different from most firefighters. I'm not a fire service member. I wish I were, but I went a different path. And I was contacted by Dan, and you're correct to give her credit. She sent me this long email, which was very heartfelt. I said, well, I'll test it. I don't think there'll be anything there. And lo and behold, it was a very highly fluorinated compound that was found in the gear that her husband had at his department. And I said, gee, is this in all the gear? And she said, I don't know, but we can get some. And she rounded up her friends, and we got donated gear, some new, some old. And we did a couple of tests. We found out that all the gear had it in, and it was because of NFPA 1971. You're required to make them flame resistant, and they've got to be this thick and this much water protection, and all of it was outlined in the rules. And the only way to meet those rules at the time was with fluorinated compounds. And we'll talk about that UV light test later, but there are several layers, and 2 of the 3 layers at least were always fluorinated. And I thought that posed a risk, but if it all stayed there, it was fine. And if only small amounts of PFAS came off, maybe it's safe. But we found that even with our students handling it, we found it on the gloves on their hand. And we said, this isn't safe. I mean, mechanical handling and water and sunlight, you guys do go out in sunlight occasionally, and you get exposed to water occasionally. That's an exposure risk. I don't know how big it is. I know that we measured lots of it coming off, but that does it get into the firefighter? That's the third question we have yet to answer. We're working with groups trying to answer that next. And there will be some migration from dust. When you get dust on yourself or combustion products, you can certainly accidentally ingest if you don't wash first. Maybe COVID's teaching us to wash before and after everything. We'll be better off with that. I think the firefighters knowing that it's on their gear means they can, don't stop wearing your gear. I mean, that's the one thing we always said. The gear is designed to keep you safe in a fire, and it does that. That's what NFPA 1971 does. It keeps your gear from burning through. It keeps you safe from steam burns. It keeps you safe from all sorts of stuff. And it's designed to do that, but it's a highly technical gear, and it's got these chemicals in it to keep, because it gave you waterproof nature. And there are other ways to keep it waterproof. And as you've now noticed, all the companies suddenly have come up with a waterproof alternative that they can sell. And it's not some of them are still in development, some of them are already done and have met NFPA standards. And we can get rid of the outer shell we can replace the outer shell with something that is NFPA approved, but is also fluorine free. And I think that's a remarkable achievement for the union. And that was definitely because of their insistence that happened. And as I said, the new leadership there seems to be doing a wonderful job of taking ownership of it and saying, hey, we didn't know, we weren't told. And I think that's very true. I don't think they were told. And when somebody asks the right questions, then you say, maybe we should look at this. And that's, I think, going to lead to change. It's turning a battleship, of course. A large organization takes a while. But I'm very pleased with the way that the fire services have responded, and the IAF in particular. They've commissioned a study to follow up my study, and not with me, but with one of the best in the world, Jennifer Field's lab. And they commissioned that study, and that paper will come out in another month or 2. And you're going to see even more alarming results out of that one. And so it backs up what we said, and worse. And so this stuff is dangerous. And I know that now. I know it's going to be harmful to the environment, but also harmful to the environment of the people who live there, which is the firefighters first and foremost. And so we'd like to reduce our exposure. It will phase out in a few years. We're making gear without this, and then over the course of 5 to 10 years, all that gear will phase out. And once we get it out of the service, then we've made it safer gear. Does that instantly reduce fire exposure deaths or firefighter line of duty deaths? Not necessarily. There may be other hazards, but this is certainly, you check them off one at a while and make the gear safer as we go. And other practices like the AFFF practice, getting rid of the AFFF is going to make a huge difference, not just for the firefighters, but for the communities they serve. The drinking water is going to get cleaner. It's going to take a while, but it will get there. And I think this is on all of our parts to sort of be aware of what we do and what our part of this is. A small community. We drink the water that for the residents you serve. And I think that it's our duty to protect you as best we can by making the gear safe, by coming up with, you come up with the policies how to use it. I don't want to try and dictate how you should respond to a fire and things like that. But if you can reduce your exposure to this gear and then get safer gear, then everybody wins. And it's not going to drive any of these companies out of business, maybe the chemical companies, but it will certainly not hurt the manufacturers of gear, because they'll make the new gear and they'll make it correctly and they'll make a good gear for you again. And I think they were hoodwinked as well. I don't think they were told. They maybe should have asked more questions, but they certainly were told it was safe. Oh, it's just a trace amount. Oh, it's, what was it, billiard balls and beach balls and all sorts of fun stuff. Great. It is the fact that we have a lot of these things floating around in the dust. And to the extent that you are absorbing dust or inhaling dust or ingesting dust, that's not good. And so we can see it in the dust studies, we can see it in the gear studies. And that's what we did. We published what was a sort of a landmark study to say, hey, we observed this. It's non-zero, guys. We got to do something about it. And that led to policy change, and individual departments said, hey, I wonder if we should stop washing the barbecues with AFFF. Yeah, we should. Don't wash the trucks down with AFFF. It's a great degreaser, but not what you want to use. And, go back to Coca-Cola. Degreaser is just fine, and probably less dangerous. And so we make suggestions. And the only thing that I have to claim for is that I made friends with Diane early, and she said she was alarming, and I said I believed her, and I said, let's go take a look. And if it wasn't so, I would have told her that, but it was, and we published a paper so that everybody would see it. And now other people are reproducing it, and it's as bad as we said, if not a little worse. And I think that that's going to be the firefighters undoubtedly, let me say, angry about this because they weren't told. It's not that you wanted anything different, but you wanted to know that this stuff had it on, and it could lead potentially to exposure. And that's what we're trying to minimize in the fire service, is getting, that's why you wear the SCBA. That's why you wear these gear to begin with, to minimize exposure and protect firefighters' lives. And the fact that we're doing things like using AFFF and potentially poisoning our own communities or poisoning our families because we've got the gear in the same extruders that other people use them for clothing. I mean, all those sorts of things are areas where we could make policy changes and things would get better. And so my only claim here is that I listened to Diane and I said, yeah, I'll take it seriously enough to measure. And now we've done that, other people are picking up. That's what science does. You publish it, everybody else can reproduce it and say, yeah, I see it, or I see it worse, or I see it better. And then we'll come up with opportunities for the gear manufacturers to come up with the PFAS-free gear. And I think Jim will go on about this UV light test. I mean, that would be the last barrier to making that entire turnout gear PFAS-free if you wanted. And it won't instantly change. You'll have to have vendors who want it. Go to the vendors and say, I want this. But then, they're pretty cognizant of market demand. And if one has, would you like your toxin-free coat or your toxin-full coat? The firefighters will choose pretty quickly. And it won't be as easy to identify those toxins, but anything that doesn't have these PFAS chemicals in it will be better for you, I'm sure.
And as with any industry, when regulations get reduced, we tend to see innovation increase, and we see the power of the free market. And I think that, it's nice to see science and the free market kind of coming together, converging on the same path to say, we want different choices. And there's not a firefighter that I've talked to as of yet. Next week, I'll be talking to a lot of them who say, I want to have these chemicals in my gear if there's a chance that it increases cancer and there's an alternative. And here, the thing that's holding up alternatives from the free market is cumbersome regulation. And the way that I read the tentative agreement, the change that we want for NFPA, Jim, is that it allows for a choice. It allows an option, because we know that, as Graham says, whether it's a battleship or an aircraft carrier, you can't turn on a 90-degree angle. We, as firefighters, I'm retired now, but as a firefighter, you take risks. We like to know the risks, so we like to be told what the risks are. I mean, if you go back 20 years, firefighters were putting AFFF foam for the kids to run in. That's how safe we believed it was. I mean, it wasn't even just limit your exposure. It was, hey, it's fire prevention day. Let's let the kids run through the bubbles. I mean, so asking those hard questions are important. But what I see with this NFPA change in the regulation that you're attempting to get done, Jim, is that it allows the free market to move forward, and it allows choice, and it doesn't handcuff the manufacturers and say with a hammer, you have to change your ways immediately. Basically, it's saying you have a choice and then let the market decide. Can you speak to that, Jim?
Absolutely, Frank. Right now, in the current state of that standard, there's no incentive for these gear manufacturers to innovate and come up with alternatives, because they are, like you said, they are locked in to having to pass this UV light test, which the only thing that's able to pass that is PFAS. So by taking that test away, it doesn't necessarily mean right away we're going to get away from these chemicals, but it allows the manufacturers to start innovating and coming up with safe alternatives with the different textiles. Again, the study that they went off of is over 20 years old now, and we've had so much advancement regarding all these textiles in that couple decades. There are alternatives out there that we could put inside there that will still do the job. It'll still be breathable, and we won't have to have these chemicals in our gear, and we can do it to where we don't have those regrettable decisions or those regrettable alternative textiles. And this is going to do is start the process to where we can get this stuff out of our gear. As long as this test is in there, it's going to keep getting kicked down the road and going further and further, and we're going to have to keep wearing this stuff. Again, like Graham mentioned earlier, you have a set of fire gear that's good for 10 years. So the sooner we could stop this is the sooner we'll actually stop all these additional exposures. You know this. We get exposed to enough stuff throughout our fire career. This is just getting rid of one exposure that we wear almost on a daily basis when we work.
Now, Graham, a lot of people are, they know, okay, it's PFAS are a forever chemical. It doesn't break down in the environment like a lot of chemicals, so it has a lasting or a staying power. I'm sure that's not a scientific term, but
it's good now.
It works for firefighters. But can you explain to our listeners why are PFAS so bad? Like, what's the actual issue with them?
Yep. And this is part of what I'll talk about at FDIC. We always do a little bit of PFAS 101. Just what is it and why are people so alarmed by this? And it hit us by surprise. Nobody was talking about this 10, 20 years ago. And suddenly now it's in every newspaper and people are getting more alarmed. And it is because there are so many uses of this stuff. We use it in firefighting gear. We use it in AFFF foam. We use it in paper products. We wrap our hamburgers in it. We use it in cosmetics. We just published that paper. We use it in paint. We use it in everything you can do. And people are exposed to a lot of it. And it is, not acutely toxic. I mean, it's not like you swallowed mercury and you'll keel over in a couple of minutes. This is something that you're exposed to that causes hypertension. It's a cholesterol mimic. It's a cancer-causing agent. You know that it takes time to expose to it. It causes testicular cancer and kidney cancer for sure. It's likely to cause some others, but we don't know what the alternative. We've studied 2 of them, and there's 4,700 to go. By the time we study them all, it'll be a couple of thousands of years we've studied them all. And there's no way to know which ones cause which cancers, but we know that as a class of these chemicals, that they are all immunosuppressants. They all knock the immune system down. And and you guys are now exposed to combustion products. You're exposed to stress and high exertion. You have all sorts of other cofactors going on. Oh, and by the way, we're going to toss an immunosuppressant. We saw this in a paper published this year on COVID patients, and they were the early COVID patients out of Denmark that Philip Granjin did, and he discovered that here's the kicker, that of the 279 or whatever it was patients they looked at, about a quarter of them had bad outcomes. They were intubated or they were intubated and died. That's a bad outcome in either case. And so the other 3/4 were the modest exposed COVID. They survived, or they didn't even go to the hospital in half the cases. And so of those 3/4, they looked at the blood levels of PFAS in those 3/4 that weren't bad outcomes, and the 1/4 that were. And the 1/4 that were had double the C4 PFAS. Now, C4 PFAS, we haven't even discussed. We talked about C8, which is the PFOA, bad, the C6, which is the replacement in the AFFs and some of the gear. The C4 is what's starting to come out of that inner liner. It's the stuff that comes along with Teflon. And that C4 is, perfectly safe. There's only small amounts of it there. Well, there's a lot of it there. There's part per million levels, but that's only trace amounts. And it is actually showing up in the lung. We see it goes to the lung and to the stomach lining. And that shows that it's going to the surface levels, and it affects, it's a soap, so it affects the function of the lungs, to the ability of the lungs to function. And so here's a relationship nobody would have predicted, because nobody knew about COVID. But if you have COVID and your lung function is already a little impaired, then you have a worse outcome. And so there's a reason for why we think C4 is producing this. C4 we haven't even put into discussion here, but it's the replacement of the replacement that's coming, and we see it in the Teflon-like manufacturer. There are now manufacturers coming up with a process in Europe that think they can do it without any chemicals, which would be great. But at the moment, all our Teflon is being made with this C4 chemical, which is perfectly safe. It goes out of your body much quicker than if it is C8. The C8 lasts in your body, as many firefighters know, and if you're exposed to AFFF or exposed to something that gives you a C8 dosage, the PFAS lasts in your blood for 5 years, roughly, and maybe 3 years for PFOA, somewhere in that range. And that means that you can have a single exposure to an AFFF incident and have it measurable in your blood for a decade afterwards. That would be horrible for most chemicals, and only trace amounts can be measured for years to come. And we don't know all the activity levels, but we know that at higher levels, you certainly induce cancers and hypertensions, and it's a cholesterol, maybe the long ones. The short chain ones are doing something different. And if there's COVID, that's bad. Who knows what else they're doing? And the fact that it only is eliminated in months instead of years says that the companies have told you, that's safe because it comes out in months and it doesn't stay in you very long. But if it's in your gear and you wear it every day, then you keep on getting exposed every day, and you'll keep on getting a sort of a level in your blood that will be measurable. It will go away if you stop wearing it for a couple of years, if it's getting into you. And this is the concern we have with this chemical. It is everywhere. It comes in different forms, so we never know which organ it's going after until we've actually studied it in mice for a long enough time. But everything we've looked at has been toxic at some level, and some of them have been extremely so. We see the latest research on pancreatic activity. Pancreatic cell lines were responding at less than a part per trillion, which is just insanely small for anybody to measure. And so that's very concerning, because if you see a cell line that responds to this chemical, how do we prevent our bodies from having that chemical show up? And while some levels of them are going down in our bodies, the C8 chemicals are now starting to decay out of our blood because we've stopped manufacturing them in the US. But the C6 chemicals are still there and rising. They're doubling every 5 years or something like that. And so that means the replacement's going to get in. When we start removing those, then we're going to have C4s and ethers and this Gen X and other things that get in there. North Carolina's ahead of us there. I mean, there's all sorts of things that we don't need to have that are going to get into our bodies, and the sooner that we can identify them. And that's why, some people tell you, this is overblown, it's not as worrisome. We think this chemical is into more water supplies than any other chemical we've made. What happens if it is a little bit more toxic than we think, and it's in everybody's water supply? We've just poisoned 70 million people or 170 million people. We don't know how many people are drinking this and what effects it will have. And there's never been a chemical that widely used that many people are drunk. So there's the concern. And it lasts for so long that it just continues to be cycled. If it gets in one product and gets in the landfill, or it gets out into the field crops and you eat the crops, it cycles through you and you continue to get exposed to it. And so it's going to be very difficult to remove. We already have tried several times, it doesn't get removed easily. One of the best ways to remove it, a little sarcastically, is to have people drink it, because then you remove it from the water by putting it in the people. But that's not a very ethical way to remove the chemical. So I think that these are the types of things that, well beyond what we want to discuss here, I'm sure, but it gives you the background of why scientists are concerned about this chemical class as a whole, and why we raise the alarm that shouldn't have people occupationally exposed to it if at all possible, especially since, it's not just the occupational exposure. We may be taking it home. We may be putting it in the groundwater for everyone if it's an AFFF. The bunker gear being kept sequestered at the firehouse is a lot safer than there's a bunch of volunteer firefighters that still take their gear home in the back seat. Yeah. I don't think I want to put my wash in with that stuff, or measure where it goes down the drain in the family drain. Those are problems that we have to solve. And luckily, it doesn't have to be done quickly. I mean, it's just about, we're talking long term, and keep wearing it while you still got fires to fight, and until we get replacement gear and all that sort of stuff. But now that you know it's there, maybe you will think about having the pants on, and when you're not on call, and putting your hands on them. Should I wash before I eat? Yeah. And we've learned a lot of good habits from COVID, right? You're going to wash your hands more often, and worried about things like that. I think we're going to treat the gear with a little more respect and say, wow, it's a well-designed gear to keep me safe in a fire, but it doesn't contain asbestos. But imagine that it did, and treat it like it did, and then you'd be a little bit more wary about it. And these chemicals aren't as dangerous as asbestos, in the sense that asbestos attacks the lung directly. Well, maybe C4 does too, but we don't know. I can't tell you the relative risk. It's just that there is a risk. It's non-zero, and that we want to keep firefighters as safe as possible. And we want the population of firefighters to have no more risk than the average citizenry with respect to things that they wear. Running into burning buildings, you guys are on your own there, but it's one of those things that we can then sort of say, look, that we've minimized the risks elsewhere.
And while asbestos occurs naturally in the environment, it's actually mined and then processed. These chemicals, these PFAS, you can't find them in nature, right? This is a man-made monster, even though it was made with the best intentions.
Yep, and it was an accidental discovery around World War II, but they're all man-made, and they are a wonderful suite of them, and they discovered they make more and more in all different types and all different properties, but their properties are remarkable. They're the best surfactants we've ever made. They separate oil and water better than any other chemical, but they also never go away. So we should be careful making a bag full of them, because now you've got a bag full of them and they're going to sit there for longer than we are. What do we do with that? Some of these chemicals will last longer than the English language has lasted. What sort of warning label are you going to put in that bottle? English, I assume.
You said there was 4,700 in that classification right now. As
there are 4,700 that have numbers assigned to them. That means they have an identification label that somebody has manufactured it and put it on a list somewhere. There's probably more than that. I've seen estimates up to 9,000 of these chemicals, and there's no way you can test all 9,000. This is one that sat in the environment for a while, and a little piece of it broke off or added a piece, and it's different. It's now got a different name, but we've probably not identified it. It looks different. It maybe has different properties, but maybe it just goes along with the rest and we don't see it. And we know many of these properties, and in the next few years, there'll be a whole revolution in how to identify these things. We see total fluorine, which is much larger than the individual pieces, and lots of very smart people are working on ways to measure the other pieces. And they'll fall into general clumps of these categories, but a lot of them are what are called, they don't decay all the way away, but they do decay from big ones down to smaller ones, like these C8 forms are very stable. But if you have a C10 or C12, that might break down to C8. And things like that. So there are these transformations that happen in the environment, especially with these new products, Gen X and things like that. It breaks down quicker. It isn't lasting for thousands of years. It probably breaks down quicker than that, but it turns into other things that do last thousands of years. A C4 molecule that we don't know where it goes or what it does, it probably isn't good. And we see the C4 implicated in COVID, for example. But so that's why we say, we had long arguments with scientists from the industry that said, oh, the C4 is perfectly safe. Look, the retention time is so much shorter. It's the ping pong ball versus the billiard ball, or versus the beach ball. And those arguments really aren't bearing up. I mean, if you look at the studies, there's lots of animal studies out, and everything we look at has some toxicity. And that's what we were concerned with, that we've got a chemical that lasts forever, that has some toxicity, has the world's best persistence, lasts for long, they're forever chemicals, and they bioaccumulate. So the fish eat it, and then the seals eat the fish, and the polar bears eat the seals. That's why the blood levels in the seals are even higher than humans, and especially in polar bears, right? So this is a global pollutant that's migrating to the poles. It's getting the top of the food chain. Humans are the top of the mid-latitude food chain. We eat everything, and some of our exposure is coming from what we eat. So if you eat a high fish diet, maybe you're getting some PFAS in there, and that's convoluted with the occupational exposure. But firefighters, we knew about the AFFF, but we didn't know about the gear.
Now, are we going to see in these studies where, because now it's clear that most of the population, if not all of the population, has some form of a baseline in their blood. So are these studies looking at the baseline of what a normal person would have in their blood versus what an occupational exposure would be? Am I correct in that?
Yep, that's the way you design a study. And they're expensive, unfortunately, because to do blood work is very expensive. But you'd take, for example, I've got 250 firefighters in my city. If I were to do a study on them and see if their blood was elevated, I'd take 250 office workers that were equivalent populations. They work in the same city, they live in the same environment, they eat much the same foods on average. They do everything the same, except some work for the fire department. And the fire department actually uses AFFF, not frequently around here, but they all wear gear and they do use AFFF occasionally. And we'd see if there was a PFAS level difference in their blood. And that would be pretty good indication that, the training once every 6 months and the occasional fire, they had an airplane crash, they had a tanker crash, but, over 7 years, there were like 3 incidents. It's not a lot, but that would be a great test study to do. I would like to get money to do that, so that you could look at the blood of an exposed population and the blood of a not population exposed and see if there's any difference. If there is, and AFFF isn't the answer, that means the gear could be doing it, or maybe the firefighters are eating something different. But those could all be controlled for variables. You could ask them what they ate and do a study. And the trick is that it's very expensive to do blood work, and we're trying to find a way to do that more cheaply. But at the moment, the tests are almost $800 a piece. And you can imagine what 500 people's blood at $800 a piece costs. It's not something that I have in my back pocket. And so we need to find somebody to fund such a study. And there's wonderful work being done by Jeff Burgess down in Arizona. He's got a firefighter cohort. He's measuring blood and he's going to measure PFAS with it. He's looking at other cancer causing biomarkers. And so I think there are funded studies, but they're not all being directed at PFAS and firefighters. And now several of them we're going to turn that way. I think NIOSH has got some new money for PFAS, and I think they're looking at it. And that's the people who should do it. They've got good facilities for doing this sort of stuff. These are just what I'm thinking of as the next steps to do. And any scientist can do these sorts of steps that do exposure science.
And if I got this right, so they get a chemical, and if the EPA does research and actually says, okay, this one looks bad, then they just change the molecules. It's still in the same family, and now they're ahead of the regulation. And then on the opposite side of the regulation, you have NFPA, which is they do great work, but it's also a burdensome regulation to get this changed. So, Jim, can you walk us through the process of how a regulation or a consensus standard gets changed through NFPA? And it's important for our listeners to realize this, because I had a conversation the other day about NFPA regulations, and they're like, well, it's a manufacturer's regulation. Well, it has end users in it, firefighters and manufacturers, but NFPA just isn't a normal type of association or group. Their consensus standards are often adopted by law in some jurisdictions, so they carry the weight of law. And then where jurisdictions and states and municipalities don't adopt them as law or regulation, they fall under OSHA's general duty clause for a recognized free environment from safety hazards. I'm not quoting it exactly. So they government backdoors in NFPA regulations under the OSHA Act, but also if you're not dealing with the OSHA regulation and you're not dealing with the state adopting the consensus standard or dealing in a court of law with a consensus standard, all of the industry essentially complies with NFPA. So you can't buy gear that's non-NFPA compliant. You can't buy a piece of apparatus that's non-NFPA compliant unless you're going to take on extra liability. So while it's from manufacturers and end users that put this regulation together, it does have the same weight as a government regulation. So Jim, if you could kind of explain how a regulation comes to being and what the process is, that would be very helpful to our viewers.
No problem, Frank. So this particular test was added, I believe, in 2006. And there's what's called a standard cycle in which you have all these members of the technical committee, which does compose of the manufacturers, but it also has the users, and it also has the researchers on there. So there's a good mixture, a sprinkling of everybody on there. So everybody kind of has a say, and they do that on purpose. So, one side doesn't control the whole standard. So usually 3 years, sometimes 2 years, they have a revision and they're able to update things. And they'll be actually doing that here starting in November. This whole 1971 standard will become 1970. They're consolidating a couple standards, and that'll start a new revision period in which that'll be, I believe, done in 2023. So they're going to be talking about this regardless. What we did with this TIA is it kind of sneaks in there in the middle of that revision cycle and tries to change it right then and there. You have to show that there's an issue with the actual part of the standard, and there has to also be an emergency. And I believe we're able to do that with this TIA. I mean, the test itself is kind of ridiculous. We're going to do a UV light test on the part of our gear that doesn't see UV light. Doesn't see that it's the middle. Does not see the rays of the sun. Yeah, that's what we're going off of. And the whole reason they came up with this was try to come up with a solution to the Breathe Tech moisture barrier problem from the early 2000s, in which it was defective. The moisture barriers itself, the company was putting out defective material, and so they basically fixed a problem which really didn't need to be fixed. It was the manufacturer's issue. So we got that, and then obviously the emergency part is firefighters are dying from cancer. Just in a couple months in Colorado Springs, almost 70% of the firefighters are going to put on that wall is from cancer. That's an emergency. And if we're having these additional exposures to lots of these chemicals, I mean, that could be leading to this. It's hard to say, but it's additional exposures that we don't need. So this TIA is set up. It goes through a couple different rounds of voting with the technical committee, and that's already happened. So what we're really pushing right now is the public comment aspect. And that's when firefighters, anybody out there can submit public comment to the NFPA, to the Standard Council, who really have the say of all this stuff. They're the judge, jury, executioner. And this is our opportunity to just speak and say, we don't want to have this stuff in our gear. We want to have alternatives. This allows us to start the process. And when you submit this public comment, it's not anything fancy. It's literally sending an email. That's all it is. So that is going to be open until August 4th. And then from there, we'll have a hearing. I believe it's going to be August 25th, where the IAFF, we basically do proponent testimony. We discuss to the Standard Council meeting why this TIA needs to pass, and somebody else will have 10 minutes to talk about why it shouldn't. I don't know who that's going to be. And then the Standard Council meeting, or the Standard Council will meet, and they'll figure out if this is going to pass or not. So that's kind of the process. But the more comments that we have, the better chance we have of actually passing this. So this is, when you do a TIA for the NFPA, you usually get under 10 comments. So we're hoping to get much more than that. Probably the easiest way to submit a comment is going to, there's a website set up for this. It's called PFASfreePPE.com. So PFASfreePPE.com. And that gives you all the information about why this is important to pass this, to give us the freedom to choose. And also kind of takes you exactly where, shows you how to submit that email in which you're able to put that public comment forth.
So this is just like contacting your legislator. It shouldn't be something that's scary or that somebody should be intimidated by. And you don't have to have a background of being a nuclear scientist to submit a comment. You could be a run-of-the-mill firefighter. You don't need to be a chief, an officer. Is that correct, Jim?
But Frank, my mom's going to put one in. She's already told me. It could be anybody.
And that's terrific. So it's real. So if you're watching this or listening to this cast, it's real easy to put your opinion. It can be your opinion of whether you want your fire department. It doesn't matter whether it's Montgomery County, Maryland, New York City, or a volunteer fire department outside of Seattle. All you have to say is that you want your fire department to be able to choose, to have a choice to be able to order gear that doesn't contain these forever chemicals. It seems like a very reasonable proposal. And just to break down the process for some of our viewers so they understand it a little bit better is NFPA, the standard is kind of like a contract that you would see in any career fire department. You have a contract, and the contract's in effect until a new one's negotiated. However, during the middle of that process, if the parties get together, they can put forth an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, a TIA, a stipulated agreement, as long as all the parties agree to alter the contract that has the same weight as the standard. Is my analysis correct?
You sound like you were a union president for a period of time, but yes, absolutely. That is 100%. All you're doing is you're getting in there and you're just changing that language temporary, which will end up becoming, future language down the road.
And that sounds very reasonable. Now, Graham, what's your take? Well, here, we always ask the hard questions on the show, so I'll put you on the spot. Are you going to be submitting testimony?
I will if I'm invited to. I think that I will certainly make a comment because Jim has made it so easy. But I'm just one of many, and I think that somebody wants to know the technical details. At the risk of going for too off on a tangent, I will mention why this UV light test is there. And that's because prior to this rule being devised in the early 2000s, there was polyurethane liners. And so we're talking about the moisture barrier, the thing that's in the middle between the outer shell and the inner layer. And there's a moisture barrier there to keep the water from wicking in between. And while the outer shell has protection, there are NFPA standard materials now that do not contain fluorine, and the outer shell can be replaced with material that doesn't contain it. But that moisture barrier is made of Teflon at the moment. And Teflon is a PFAS, but it's a polymeric form, which it's safe. Well, yes, it is. If you ate it, it would pass through you. It wouldn't be ingested. But it is Teflon. And Teflon is a PFAS, and it's made in a solvent that it contains these short molecules, these C4s and other things that are PFAS. Pure PFAS, they're all man-made. And they're there and they come off. There's only small amounts of them. And they're very small and they pass out of your system quickly. Well, we know that if you wear it every day, having something pass out of your system every day is not good. So I'm still very leery of them. I think it's an exposure risk you don't need. I think there are other ways to make more. I think you could go back to polyurethane and you'd achieve the same effect there. And the only reason you can't do that is this UV light test. The UV light test is not just regular UV light. It's not like going to the beach. It's a hard xenon lamp UV, which is the 1% of the sun's light, natural sunlight. It's way down in the hard ultraviolet, which just means that the strongest rays possible. And they can crack polyurethane, but they can't crack Teflon. And so Teflon lasts, but there's none of that exposure, especially inside a suit, to UV light. The firefighters don't emit such wondrous light. There's no reason to put that in there, and it's put in there so that one chemical has an advantage over another. And Teflon certainly is a remarkable material, but the way it's made now is it's made in a solvent of PFAS, and that solvent material comes along for the ride. And you are getting, we observed that in the study we did, that the inner liner had plenty of it coming off. And so the question is, technically it's like we're asking us to consider having the option of Teflon or an option of polyurethane, which is just one example. Maybe there are greener alternatives. People can make even better ones. I'm not a textile manufacturer. There are probably better ways to make it. And I'm sure somebody out there has several ideas how to do it. But even going back to a better version of the previous work would be an option, and that would allow you to avoid PFAS entirely. And that means the gear wouldn't have that chemical. And it's all being held up by this one rule. And I would ask people to question why that rule is there, and just ask logically. And I think the history of that rule is very important to understand, because somebody put it in there for a reason. And the reason was that this material is better, it lasts longer, but against a type of exposure that you don't typically see. And so maybe we have stuff that lasts a little less long, but is still waterproof, does the moisture barrier function, would meet NFPA criteria, except for that one lamp test. And that's what I'm concerned with, that somebody's tried to make an end run to get one material over another. And that could be, but I'm not sure the firefighters themselves care what material it is, as long as they're safe wearing it.
So we see a regulation that we as firefighters think that's there to keep us safe, but it could have possibly been put into effect to give one competitor an edge over another through a regulation?
It's possible. I will not say that that's true because I don't know that, but I know that the main distinguishing feature of that test is to say the Teflon wins and polyurethane doesn't. And is there a moisture barrier that could be made out of polyurethane that's safe? I assume so, because it was made that way up until 2006. But could it be made again? Is it better? Can you make it better than before? And I'm sure that you could. And there might even be greener alternatives yet. I don't know. But I think that the firefighters deserve the opportunity to find out. And that's what this petition is for, I think. And so I'll support it.
Jim, when I research a law in Connecticut, I can go to the state library, I can go right online and find out the legislative history. I can actually read the floor debate to kind of get an idea of how the law or regulation came about. Does NFPA have a library? Is there a way to get a transcript of how this came to be? What was the argument on both sides of why that UV light on the, and I think you said it best, you're like, it's on the inside of your coat. We're not even talking outer shell here. So it doesn't pass the firefighter common sense test.
Yeah, well, Frank, this is all based off of a student's thesis at the University of Kentucky back in 2000, and I believe another student piggybacked on top of that and did an amendment to that as well. Not an amendment, but they added on to what a Chastity Newsom did in 2000 with Dr. Easter from UK looking over all this stuff. I drove down to the University of Kentucky to get my hands on this book, where supposedly that was the only place it existed, was at the student's library. And just because nobody had seen it, there was no copies of it. It was a mystery. It was it was a little bit crazy. And now, lo and behold, convenient. It was so convenient. I did that the very next day. Magically, it appeared like there was a different version that had the other students' information on there, had PowerPoints and conspiracy. I don't know what you want to call it, but it landed the very next day and could have saved me a few hour drive. But
wait, so it wasn't on the internet. It wasn't on the internet, and then it was on the
internet. When we were told in the original 1971 meeting regarding this TIA, was the only copy that existed was in the library, and nobody had been able to go there because of COVID. That is what Dr. Easter said during that call, because conveniently she was invited to that call, and magically I could tell you the copy that was sent out to everybody was not that copy, because I had a hard book. It was a hard book. It was in leather or whatever. And the copy that came out was it was out of a binder. It had binder holes, and again, it had that other part to it that wasn't what I had in my hand. So it appeared somehow. So we've been able to look at all that. And when you kind of alluded to it, the test itself, this thesis by the student, it was paid for by Lion. So there you go. If you're wondering how the manufacturers are involved, they're the one that helped pay for this thesis, and magically, all this gear now has to have these chemicals. Now, did I think? Well, I say back then, did they think that these chemicals? Did they know that it was going to be as bad as they are? Probably not. But they're also the same manufacturer that has it in all three layers. So, and I think that's a lot of ways, and this is just my opinion, they don't really want to get away from this stuff because they're so damn invested in it. They don't want to have to do the research and development to find alternatives.
Well, hopefully with this comment period being open and the policy pressure being put on by people like yourself, the independent work of scientists actually putting the data forward, and the passion brought forward by people like Diane and her husband to kind of put the emotion and the human face to this issue. Hopefully the free market will help fix this problem, as it usually does. You can tell I work for a think tank when I get $1 every time I say the word free market. Full disclosure. But no, it actually is true. If you reduce regulation, usually increases innovation, and hopefully the free market will pick the right path if they are educated and have the right information, because nobody wants to buy gear if they believe in their heart or through the science that the gear is going to make them sick or increase the chances of making them sick. And Graham, I know you're not a doctor, but you're more qualified to speak on this than anybody else. When it comes to somebody getting actual cancer from any helicopter, it's the gear, it's the chemical companies. So I'll put my tinfoil hat on. But no, I know you're not a doctor, but when it comes to somebody getting exposed to a chemical and ending up with a form of cancer, a lot of it depends not only on the actual chemical, the amount, the time of the exposure, but also the individual's genetics. I don't know if genetics is the right word. Can you speak to that? Because it's just like cancer from the products of combustion. They harm us all, but different people respond differently. Can you shine any light on that beyond what a firefighter could put together?
Sure, only in the general terms, but you're right. It's a series. You can think of cancer as being prevented all the time. Your body is fighting cancer, and it's prevented by a series of gates. And those gates prevent the cancer from taking over the cells or reproducing in your body. There's always cancer cells floating around, and your body immune system prevents them. There are other genetic factors you mentioned, or environmental factors that will keep them. If you keep in better shape, you're less likely to get certain types of cancers. If you don't get exposed to, there's some cancers that are caused by a virus that'll come through and damage the organ, and that organ is then more likely to get cancer later on. So there's this remarkable interplay in the human body of all these things going on, and most of the time the cancer cells are fought off. A radiation damage causes cancer just every day, and yet your body repairs most of them just correctly. It kills the cells and throws it out. That's just a very general biology understanding of cancer. And so it's a complicated disease. You can never say that your cancer came from this exposure, because there's lots of exposures, and it's usually a combination. But boy, you can see statistical inferences. If I take a large group of people and I measure that they get exposed to a higher levels of this, I see more of this type of cancer. That's the generalization. And you know it from anecdotal evidence. Your grandfather smoked cigarettes 90 years of his life and he never got lung cancer. And yet another person never smoked a day in his life died of lung cancer last week. And that's, how does that work out? And it's the statistics of, nobody is a statistic. You can look at population statistics, but the individual is different. And perhaps you had the unfortunate aspect of having a genetic predisposition towards breast cancer, and the next person did not. And so you would not have expressed that in a normal situation, but your immune system was compromised for whatever reason, and then you got breast cancer. Does that come from the exposure you had? Well, indirectly, yeah, it helped, but we couldn't prove it in you or any individual. And that's the hardest thing, because if you have cancer, you're fighting for your life and you want to know how you did it. You'd like to prevent other people from going through the same experiences. And it's a heart-wrenching experience for those and their loved ones. And I can't say enough about the people that are fighting on both ends. They've got fighting to keep their job, trying to get their benefits. And oh, by the way, you've got cancer, by the way, too. And that's awful. And so I heartfelt appreciation to the guys that are doing this. And unfortunately, firefighters are doing it at double the rate of the rest of the population. And we've got to work on that. And there's a lot of studies going on. Not a lot of answers yet as to why these are. We know combustion products are bad. But you're protected more from them than ever before, yet the cancer rates aren't going down. So is it something in the gear? Is it something in the procedure or the policies, or are we missing something? Or maybe we're changing more environmental factors that we don't know about. Those are things we have to study some more. And I wish I had answers. I don't have answers for that.
That was an interesting point that you just made, that we're protecting our firefighters better and better from the products of combustion, but the cancer rates seem to be, not going down. And anecdotally, I think they're going up. When I entered the fire service 20 years ago or 30 years ago, it was, maybe I was just not paying attention, but I didn't know firefighters who were getting cancer early in their career, middle of their career. Firefighters were dying young. It seemed like anybody who had an obituary past 71 was doing really well. But I don't remember firefighters on the job coming down with cancer. And now we see it in alarming rates. And to your point of we're doing a better job of protecting people from the products of combustion, is we're seeing those cancer rates from firefighters in slow departments, busy departments, and medium departments. So what is the common theme? Everybody, and I'm not saying it is, but possibly it could be that everybody's wearing their bunker gear, and we love to wear our bunker gear all the time. So until we have, why not have a choice while we search out all of the answers? And I don't think a lot of the manufacturers are evil. I don't think they want to kill or have their people come down with cancer. I do think that sometimes there's a culture of profit, and that regulations, good regulations and bad regulations, sometimes make for this issue that we have before us. But there are some nefarious people out there too, and that get mixed into the bunch, and we've seen that over the years. And I'm going to recommend to our viewers today and it's not like a scientific movie. It's if you're interested in the law or you're interested in this at all, watch Dark Waters. It's the Rob Bilott story and the DuPont story. And I watched it with my wife, and my wife even thought it was a great movie, but it's a great story of courage and what it takes to fight for what you think is right. And it's great that we have people like Jim carrying the flame, people like Diane. The IAFF is now stepping up. And Graham, your independent work is so critical to firefighters' safety, and it allows everybody to ask the why. We're at the witching hour, but if you could tell everybody when your class is at FDIC. FDIC is next week after a year of not having FDIC. So I'm real excited to see everybody. I will be teaching Monday a pre-conference workshop on tactical leadership, how to build your influence and increase your command presence. You may not learn anything if you go to my class, but I will entertain you. If you want to learn something and really get squared away, you need to go to Graham's class. Graham, can you tell us a little bit about your class at FDIC next week?
I'm teaching on Friday morning, and it will be a class on PFAS and the firefighter services. It'll be sort of backgrounds that bring everybody up to the same base level. And then we'll tackle some of these questions about what can we do as individuals, what can we do as an organization, what we know and what we have yet to know. And it's supposed to be informative. It's I'm not sure it's going to be as entertaining as yours, but it will certainly be lots of questions and lots of people there with common concerns. And I'd be happy to answer as many questions as I can. I learn as much from these sessions from the attendees as I give out information, because people are telling me, oh, the fire services do this. Is this a problem? Well, I never knew you guys did that, but boy, that would be a problem. Those types of interactions are good. And boy, Frank, I hope you're wrong. I hope it isn't anything to do with the gear that's causing this, but what if it is? I mean, that's what keeps me up at night. I sort of like, see, we got to figure this out, and we'll figure it out. And I hope it's not the gear. I think there's a possibility that there are more toxic products than ever before in our houses, and most of them are residential house fires still. And we're getting more toxins in the air. Maybe they go through the gear, maybe they go through the respirator. I don't know, but those are things that are all out there to be worried about. And I'll talk about all these things and more on Friday.
Oh, I think you're going to have a great class. And Jim, it's critical. This is the call to action, because next week is FDIC, but there's a deadline to submit your comment. And don't be afraid to submit a comment. Nobody's going to come back and ask you a question about your comment. You're not giving verbal testimony. So just simply saying what your opinion is, and if you want your fire department to have a choice, if you want the free market to determine how your municipality or state spends their money, it's just your opinion. Nobody's going to go back to you for a follow-up. So don't be afraid to send the email. Jim, can you give the date, give the website again, and give your last call to action?
Absolutely. The deadline for the public comments is August 4th, and the website is pfasfreeppe.com, and it'll lead you on there. You're just sending an email, and it could be as simple as firefighters should have the option of having gear that doesn't have these chemicals in it. Our gear should protect us. It shouldn't harm us. It could be something as simple as that. But just, we're not really looking for even the quality of emails. It's more the quantity. So just take a minute, PFAS-free PPE, just write something out. It would really, truly help us in this fight.
All right, Jim, if you could send a link to that to Peter from Fire Engineering, he'll post the link below the show. We want to thank Peter for doing a great job, as he always does. Thank Bobby Halton, who's on a plane to FDIC as we speak. And we hope to see everybody at FDIC next week, and we want everybody to get out your phone. We know you're probably on your phone while you're watching this thing right now. Just think it'll only take you a second to just send an email so that your city or town could have a choice. Graham, keep up the great work. Thanks to everybody out there. I'll tweet it out tonight as well, and I'm really looking forward to next week. I haven't even really been out of the house in a year and a half, so that's why the pizza keeps getting bigger. So I'm real excited to be out there, because every time I go to FDIC, I learn something more than I even bring there. So looking forward to being there. And Peter, you can take us off. And you guys were great. This was a great show. I've proven scientifically today that I don't need PJ Norwood. No, just kidding. He always
He's gone. He's gone.
PJ always makes it better. So, and he can pronounce everybody's name. So I can't wait to have him and Bobby back next. Peter, take us off. Thank you.